Welcome to the DWRDNET YouTube interview series. Today on the show, we have Chase Gustafson, who's one of my good friends and an artist and video producer, director who lives in Memphis. Chase, I'm glad you're able to take some time to talk today. So just give everybody a brief introduction of who you are and what you do and how you kind of got into the stationery-ish hobby.
Stationery-ish hobby. You know where I'm from in Minnesota, the word ish means gross. So if you don't like something, you say ish.
Good to know.
Well, pens have always been, sorry, I'm playing with a couple pens down here. Pens have always been kind of part of my life. I went to art school, and as all good art kids know, you have pencils, colored pencils, paints, brushes, and then inks. At least back in my day, in the early 90s, we had to have India ink and then various shades of blues and blacks. And it was the dip ink. Back then, I didn't know that it was a fountain pen and a nib and all that stuff, and I'm still not all that great. But that was the first introduction to the scratchy scratch on drawing boards and stuff like that. And then I will say, as an art director and a graphic designer, as my main career, I've always appreciated a good roller ball or a good felt tip just for having notes as I'm working. And it wasn't really until, shocking, you, as you said, good friends we are, got me into the fountain pen world back when you gave me the Lamy Safari as a gift. And that pen has been retired, and now I'm really only have one. So that's kind of where the start is, and that's kind of where it is now. So
Okay. So obviously, since you just have the one, what kind of ink do you have in your pen currently?
currently, the ink that's in my pen is the stock refill that comes with the Cross Bailey pen, and it is just a little ink cartridge that you push in. But I have a converter refill on the way because a friend of mine gifted me a really pretty neon orangey spring color that I asked for, and as soon as that converter gets here, that's what will be in my pen. And yeah, there you go.
Okay, so up to now, you've mainly been cartridge. You have a converter coming with your first true bottle of ink. So I guess my next question that I have is kind of a standard: is how many inks do you have? So I guess it'll be a bottle and some cartridges.
Right.
Okay, so that's pens and inks. What about papers? What kind of paper do you prefer to write on? Are you a blank page, a lined page, a dot grid? Do you use art paper, or what do you write on?
Moment, and when it comes to journaling and anything like that, I found for now I prefer dot grid. Um, well, actually, I take that back. Right now, this is grid. I guess is that right?
I can't see all that clear. If it's solid lines, it's grid.
Yeah,
If
it's
it's
solid
just
lines, little
dots,
squares,
then it would be dot grid. Yeah, so that's grid.
and I love the little field notebooks because I don't journal a ton, but I do like it because the grid helps me, if you can see, lay out things as I'm going. And between this and a dot grid are my favorites. If I see line, just the way I think, if this helps with anything, if I have lined, I think notebook for like quick notes, and I won't use this or any size as such. It'll just become a notebook because 30 something years of using steno pads to take notes, you're going to get, bear with me here, stuff that's just jotted notes, sketching. This is a new one, so it's empty. I have another one over there. But it just is a catch-all. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a catch-all for everything. And if I want to be organized, I prefer to have what I would say is a proper, more of a journaling notebook. Now, as far as you said for drawing and art papers, that depends on the project. If there's a default, it's going to be a Canson or a Strathmore sketch pad. And at that point, the paper doesn't matter to me as much as the pen and knowing what the pen's going to do on that paper. Because the same way with brush and paint, I can use any brush and any paint on any paper. That paper, like you probably know way better than me, with fountain pens and nibs and inks, how it's going to feather, how it's going to absorb, how it's going to take off and wick or not. So it comes down to the pen in my hand and how it feels, and how that feels as an art instrument outside of taking notes or journaling or using it as a just strictly writing utensil. The paper, I'll have to adapt the pen to the paper. So some pens, if I'm using your typical dip ink, tell me what the word is. I don't know what the word is for just the standard, like, long black handled plastic handle with a nib sticking out of it. Not a
That would
fountain
be
pen.
a dip nib in a nib holder. So
Okay.
probably what it was called in art class, very similar. But
Yeah,
yeah,
they just
it's
called it
really
an
common. A
ink
lot of
pen.
people, and yeah, well, a lot of people when they swatch inks, they'll use those kind of calligraphy based or art
Yeah, yeah,
based.
yeah, yeah.
You can go to Michael's right now or any craft store and
Mm-hmm.
get that basic speedball set that has a couple of nibs, the black plastic handle.
Right.
They have the art inks. Fountain
Yeah.
pen inks are just the big difference in the inks is that the art inks will clog up most fountain pens because they're thicker. They're meant to lay down differently. So a lot
Ah.
of the fountain pen inks are more water based so that they can flow through the feed and a converter. You're not just dipping in and it'll run off the metal. You have to change those nibs out because they'll rust over time. As you're aware from the art side. So
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
really
I've
just called
rusted.
yeah.
Now you're cluing me in on things back when I was in my early 20s at art school. Why, if I hadn't touched and some of those nibs in a while, some of them would be really gummed up or rusted, just depending on the ink. But back in the day when comics were taking off, the calligraphy style nib holder pens or what everybody, all those comics used, because a lot of them didn't color. Just much like comic books now, you have an inker and a colorist. That's what a lot of like the infamous documentary, you see Charles Schultz with the long, imagine my screwdriver is the ink pen. He's dipping and scratching, and it's really loud on that illustration board. But that illustration board has a tooth to it, and it's kind of wavy if you've ever used any of that kind of stuff. And that's if you ever look at Charlie Brown, Snoopy, Peanuts comics, there's a little wavy line around everything. That's just because he's laying that fountain pen or that nib into that, trying to get a nice solid black line, and you get kind of the what I would call the anxiety lines of the Peanuts characters because they're not perfectly smooth. So, yeah.
Okay. So we talked about papers. What is your favorite stationary adjacent item? And what I mean by that is like, how do you carry your things around? Do you have a favorite messenger bag or a lap desk? Like some of mine, I have a book weight that you might have seen that I'll put on the notebook to hold it open, or a clip to hold the pages open. What are some of those items, or your top two items, let's say, of your adjacent items? You're carrying your pins around. Do you have a case for them? Tell me, what would you consider those kind of stationary adjacent? So they're not necessarily a stationary item per se, but they go hand in hand.
Well, number one is a good bag. And since I'm a photographer, I carry my camera with me every day. So I have a really nice Manfrotto um, shoulder messenger type bag. I can carry all kinds. It's a decent size. It's about as wide as my shoulders, and um, it's a beautiful bag. And there's a slot in the back of it that's meant for a laptop, but that gets all my stationery items. That gets my fountain pens and stuff. They usually clip. I have a very bad, very cheap. It's around here somewhere. Um, from one of the major craft stores. I couldn't tell you which one. Pencil bag, and it's kind of not the best thing because it's just like a overnight hygiene bag. It just one zipper and everything just gets dumped into it. And it's great when you're trying to just put your pencils away and keep them together. But I think that to tangent off your question, I think that's my next stationary purchase is a nice pen and pencil carrier where they're slotted. Um, and the top two stationary adjacent. Well, since I'm still kind of new to all this, is I don't know, dude. I don't know if I've got a secondary thing because I've got like two
No,
pens and some
and that's
notebooks, and
fine.
that's it.
For with two pins, you're not needing
Right,
necessarily.
right.
You're not going to have that many accessory items that you'd be using on a regular basis yet.
My shopping list
You know,
includes a weight, a little bit larger of a dot or gridded paper, and I'm excited to try some of these Japanese papers I've seen you review and talk about, and a nice pen holder, like I don't know the proper term, convertible or whatever. I don't want a pouch. I'd rather have something that lays flat and the top opens up. I've seen something like that, and it looked intriguing and would be nice to have them all filed in, and you open the top and slide out what you want, and away you go.
yeah, there's
So,
a bunch of different things like that, and I'll put some links, some from some of the ones I have. You might have seen in some of the videos. I have some of the Lochby cases. Um,
hmm,
Recently, I've working with Vanessa, and I have an affiliate discount. Code DWRDNET, and they
ooh,
have different pen cases and storage options there. So there's a bunch. You can get really down into the weeds, but like you said, the most basic is a dot kit or a pencil case, that you would have in school. I was at Michael's the other day getting some stuff as I branch into trying watercolor, and they
right,
had all the little basic, like, brush the roll up where you have the slots, you put your pens and pencils in, and then roll it up and tie it with a string. So
right, yeah.
kind of goes the full gambit.
I had one of those in
So
college, and I didn't like it because you unroll it and it just takes up all this space, and you're like, oh, there's 40 pins and I have like 6, and then you gotta roll it back up, So I didn't
yeah, I
like it much,
actually,
but
one of the links I'll put afterwards, it's called the Lochby Tool Roll. And it kind of started, that company is unique. I have a bunch of their items, and my wife even has her pen cases are mostly Lochby at this point because our local stationery store carries that brand. So it's kind of this is what you're familiar with. But it's a tool roll, so it has a zippered pouch, but then it also has. Actually, let me see. It's right here. Let me just show this. Now I'm just getting into watercolor, and we're traveling soon, so this is gonna not be the. Make sure I don't spill everything out. So it's got a little zippered pouch here where you can put in. Like right now, I have some masking tape to tape the watercolor paper down to the board. It's got a flap. It's got pockets in the back where you have like the brush pouch of the travel brushes.
yeah.
And then it's got different elastics. You can cram a whole bunch of stuff in there.
Now in that bag, is
And
there
then,
little places that little hang hooks or anything like that?
what do you mean by hang hooks?
So if you're not painting on a desk or a flat top, some brush
You
rolls
could
like
make
that.
it. So the way this bag secures is it's got one of these little climbing clasps.
Yep.
So when you roll it up, it will, go around in clasp. But it also has one right here, so you could literally make a loop and hang it around the back of a chair or the rail
Or
on a
an easel
desk, or
leg or something like. Gotcha. That's what I was
yeah,
after.
ease a leg, or even like we were at Starbucks the other day, and I noticed on one of their big tables they have headphone hangers. It's probably more for power cables hanging down from the desk, but that's one of my latest things that I like it. Beth actually has one of these. She was one of her earlier pin cases, and then she's expanded after she filled up the first case.
Jeez.
So yeah, that's the pin hobby. So let's get into the main, kind of part for you as an artist. Did it feel pretty natural to get into the fountain pen use? After I'm sure so many years you were doing, like you said earlier, dip pens, a good roller ball. You know, have you always been, I know for myself back in probably high school, the Precise V5 was like the pen to have in school. That was kind of the early roller ball that had that popularity with the needle point on it. Did
Right.
it feel pretty natural to get into the fountain pens once you actually had one and kind of started using them?
Yeah,
Especially
because
with the caveat, you being left-handed, that
yeah,
factor in to the fountain pen, use.
yes, and being left-handed, you never think, "Oh my God, I'm left-handed." You just kind of, being my age, the silver gives away that I'm just turned 52. You always just make things work for you. It's still to this day. weird to actually get a left-handed pair of scissors that makes your thumb feel comfortable. But to your point, any tool in art, you just kind of always make it work. So yeah, fountain pens felt natural. Just from experience, I knew if I push too hard or I do something too much, it's gonna leak, it's gonna drift, it's gonna cause mistakes. So when I started recently, just starting using fountain pens more and more, I noticed two things. I noticed that I'm sure if I bought a nicer pen with a nicer nib, it would probably perform better. And secondly, you make the tool in your hand work, and you just know that once you get the rhythm going, it just feels like any other tool, a soft or a hard pencil, a brush with a lot of ink or no ink, roller pens, felt pens, brush pens, etc. So it's a great tool to have. Um, I would like more with different nib points and things like that, knowing that. And, like if I had three tools, a pencil, a roller ball, and a fountain pen, there's three ways of thinking in the art world. And the fountain pen falls in line with the roller ball, is that if you're going somewhere to sketch, like go to a city, like if you take a trip overseas and say you're in Amsterdam, just making this up, and you sit down to sketch, I would reach for a roller ball or a fountain pen over a pencil, because most artists, if you have a pencil in your hand, you're instantly try to think recreation. I want to draw what's in front of me, and if you make a mistake, you want to erase. And you don't have time. If you're visiting a city and you gave yourself 20 minutes to sit on a bench and enjoy the city and sketch, you don't have time. You just take a permanent pen, and mistakes and all, you just keep drawing and you just get better and better and better. And I'm sure I went off of your question there a little bit, but I love them as tools, especially fountain pens, because there's a different vibe, a different feel, and especially painting over the top of, or drawing over the top of color swatches you either put down with a brush or a marker. Fountain pens come right on top and give you a really nice line. So it's a beautiful tool.
Well, and another good friend of mine, Marissa, who you actually happens to know, because some of my great friends, they all live in Memphis and I live in Nashville. But she said, she's also a lefty and a big fountain pen user, that most left-handed people know more about stationery and pens than anybody with a right hand, because like you said, you've been dealing with it your entire life. You have to
Yep.
make it work, and nothing. You're a left-handed person in a right-handed world, so you
Yeah,
kind of
that's
have to adapt, like even just the orientation. You said you use steno pads,
yeah,
probably because the rings are on the top, because you're
right.
not having to deal with the ditch of a binding and whatnot. And even some
And,
of the stationery companies now are starting to do horizontally rung, the ring, it's a horizontal,
right.
so that you're writing with the rings on top, but you still have a format of paper that would be kind of more standard in a traditional left hand or right hand bound
That's the beautiful thing of this
notebook.
being lefty, is that it's small. So I don't, you know this. Some lefties, I write normal. I don't write hook. I don't write like this. Some lefties do. I don't, and so they do that because they don't want to smear, you know. I just get down low, and I have, good Lord, my whole life I've always had graphite on the bottom of my hand. But that's the beautiful thing about this little book, is that it's small and I can turn it to where my hand is, and bigger. The steno pad size, the 5x7 or 5x8, is just big enough, but it's also on a desktop. It's a little too big, so you have to push your keyboard around. This little thing is great as a lefty. And then sketch pads, you just buy them. They do make sketch pads in left hand bound or top bound. You just buy them and you just turn them. As a lefty, you don't even think, like, there's no proper way where those holes, because if you're taking something, normally you don't, like, see, here's a small sketch pad, and it is a little Strathmore drawing pad, so it's got some toothsome to it. It's off white. In fact, I'm curious. Indulge me for a moment. I'm going to see how, just drawing a
Well,
circle.
while you're
Go ahead.
drawing on there, just to ask, you said that's off white. is that a preference that you have? Is that from your art background, or just that's
No, it's
what
just
was
this
on
thing was
sale
like
that day at the
$4.
store? Yeah, that's what was on sale.
Right, it was $4, and I wanted a small pad to sit in my lap because often if I'm sitting in my couch and I want to sketch in the natural light, I have a pillow in my lap, and my cat inevitably ends up. And if I have a big notebook, I can't do it. But if I have this little thing, I can still dink around with the cat in my lap. So bear with me here. I'm doing some doodling. I'm not drawing, but doodling gives me a good idea of how a tree or this ink and paper. This works really well on this.
Well,
Go ahead.
and that would make sense. A lot of the fountain pen friendly papers. That's so with you being newer and someone who might be listening who's not familiar. Fountain pen friendly is a somewhat subjective term. You know, that's going to be a little bit different for everybody. The general characteristics are it doesn't bleed through, it doesn't smear easily, it dries fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some of the highlights. And paper thickness really comes into play. Some of the Japanese paper, they're always measured in grams,
Right,
metric
right.
system. But from a art standpoint, if you're used to using, whatever pound weight paper, as we know, thicker cardstock, the thicker the paper, the more absorbent it'll be, the less likely you're probably going to have smears or things like that. So it's a very similar carryover. A lot of people like to use watercolor paper, for instance, to swatch their inks on because it's kind of the happy medium between
Right.
the office paper that's trash you have to use at work, and then the high end paper. They don't want to use the high end paper for swatching, so watercolor is kind of that happy medium, meet in the middle type
So you
scenario of the art supply world.
let me ask you this as a just a question for somebody like you who's got years of experience with papers and inks and stuff. This sketchbook is 80 pounds slash 130 gram. It's a pretty thick paper. Um, what is that? I mean, you can hear and see how thick that paper is. It's great for sketching so you don't get imprints and your pen or your ink doesn't dive into the paper and mess up your line work and your shading and so forth. It stands up to whatever you're putting onto it, so you can control your tool. Which that's not a good phrase. Um, but is that a heavier weight paper? Is that common? I mean, I
So
know
I
I
have
could
a
just
couple
live
of
with
notebooks
something like
here. I
this.
was looking. It's common on a lot of these notebooks. They'll have the paper weight listed. Now, this Irriful, which is really good for color, it does not currently say, but from a feel, it's also a thicker paper, so that's probably a 70 or 80 gram. Just when
Okay.
you've held papers enough.
Yeah.
Some of the thickest paper I've seen, I think, would be not Japanese, but Clairefontaine, which is actually a French paper, or Rhodia. I'm sure you've used Rhodia paper
Oh yeah.
before.
I've used a lot of
It's
rodeo
a
products.
it's going to be similar to that. So a lot of the Japanese papers are thinner. You know, 90 is, like I said, is about the highest. Kind of the one of the gold standards is called Tomoe River. The original formulation is like the Grail. I found a notebook of it that had been sitting on the shelf for many years. I took it to the pen show recently, and we were doing a panel. And some people had never had a chance to actually write on it, so I was like, here's your chance. Use a page and write on it just to see the difference because they had to reformulate it over time. But like the Lochby system, like I was talking about, if you get one of their notebooks, I think it's 75 gram Tomoe River. And then the other thing you'll see, which is common on the Japanese papers, is some of them are coated, some of them are
Oh,
uncoated. So they've got a different texture to it.
okay.
I just had a couple of new papers arrive, which I haven't done my video on yet, but I have them here just to kind of show. This is Life Bank paper, which is really common in the fountain pen community. And it even comes, this is probably something as a lefty, it comes with a sheet of blotter paper as the very first thing in the notebook. So you
Yeah.
could hold your hand down or blot the
Yep.
ink. But this is, one on the thicker side. So, this is hard to show with this, but I mean, you can see that's a thicker paper.
Oh, for sure.
And
Yeah.
then this is the You Sorry. I did a video on this, and This is just the loose leaf version. I really liked it in the notebook. It's the one that I thought could be a Japanese Clairefontaine replacement, is what that video is called. And then this one is a new paper that I've not yet tried, and it's an 80 gram, but it is slick. I mean, you can hear it's got a texture to the paper itself, so it's very smooth and slick. It doesn't have the grit. So that means nibs are going to glide across it really easily, but then, it'll be interesting to see once I get a chance to write on that and do a video of how that affects the dry time. That really comes into play when the inks are drying and whatnot. But so we're getting to about the half-hour mark. So as we start to wrap up, did you have any questions? Like you said, you're newer to this. We talk all the time, but something kind of general questions that you think might be beneficial for someone else who's newer to the hobby, or anything like that you can think of offhand?
Yeah. Questions I have, when I've noticed you can get any kind of pen made out of any kind of material, thickness, something that you prefer, a thin or a thicker, and longer and shorter pens, etc. To me, that seems like it's secondary. I mean, once you establish hand feel for the tool that you're going to be writing with, what are I see talk. I mean, there's extra fine, medium, large nibs and stuff like that. But is there a material or different grades of nibs? Where is the investment point that you'd want to say, hey, you've got a $20 starter pen, and if you went into a $100 pen where you can change nibs, or whatever, do you understand the gist of my question? Where do nibs come into play, and what's a better material, and what should you look for?
So that's kind of an open-ended question in a way. But nibs are 99% of the time one of two materials: steel or gold. The outlier would be like titanium nibs,
Right.
which are out there but not as common. But when I started 10 years ago in this hobby, the steel nibs were not like they are now. A lot of the maker pins, like the ones in my recent video from the Arkansas Pen Show, where I got a nice, maker pin that's this one here, the Newton with the three-side triangle shape.
Mhm.
This is a normal steel nib, but I got a grind on it from a Nibmeister. So if you write with this pen, it's going to feel completely different than this same exact nib made the same day next to it in the same factory that hasn't been ground or tuned. You know, so to answer your question, you can get, you could go probably right now to a craft store and get a steel nib that will work okay.
Right.
But if you think of metals, think of sharpening a knife. Everybody's sharpened a knife or seen knife sharpening before. The more you polish that tipping material, the smoother your writing experience will be to a point. If you do it too much, like if you're sharpening a knife too much at one point, it actually is worse than when you started. It's very similar with a nib. If you flatten out part of a nib too much, it's called what's known as baby's bottom. So then when you're writing with it, it kind of catches. That's a common
Yep.
term. So, you know, I did a video a while back comparing, a $300 pen that I've had for a decade to a $26 pen I bought off Amazon. And the final result is that $26 pen was actually really good.
Yeah.
You know, if that would have existed with that vacuum filler and the look and everything 10 years ago, I would have been hard pressed to say I would have bought the $300, because how many of those 26? I mean, I could have had a whole
Yeah.
fleet of $26 pens. The technology over time, the materials, just the stationery industry and popularity, it's getting a resurgence. What used to be the standard in the 40s, 50s, the ballpoint pen really changed that. But we've all used ballpoint pens in the past, and I know for me, I write really small, and I grip the pen really tight because I write really small, so my hands would cramp.
Yeah.
I personally prefer a bigger body pen. Like you were saying, you can get them in all different makes and models. Thinner pens don't work with how I write. So
Right.
that's the nice thing, is you can find a pen body or shape, and then the aesthetics on a side.
Right.
There's I can think of 10 resin makers off the top of my head. So this pen that I've had, and I like the colors, the blues and blacks, you might be like, that's the ugliest resin I've ever seen.
It's not
And that's
ugly.
fine. But no, but you know what I
I
mean.
know what you're
You
saying.
could go get the Andre Agassi
Oh,
orange
you're gonna go
and
there, huh?
an 80s themed, because we Jonathan
The
Butler,
shirt
who
I'm
runs
wearing.
Butler Stationery in Columbia, he wanted to make the ugliest pen he could, so he was learning how to turn a pen with some of the local pen makers, and he found this blank that was like the most obscure mix of colors. But
Wow.
when they turned it down, it lost one of the colors, because that's the
Right,
thing with
right.
resins. Even when production pens are released, you might say, "Oh, I'm going to get this pen. This is all the advertising material. Is this? That they've shot perfectly in a studio with, you know, whole crew." And then the version you get, wait, where's the blue in this? This is supposed to have blue, and the
Yeah,
way that resin happened to mix, yours didn't end up with any blue. So that's actually, um, you know, something that you have to kind of that's why it's nice to see pins at a pin show. You
yeah,
get to see the finished product. You're not going off a marketing photo of it will probably look similar to this, but there's no guarantees. There's no
yeah.
two resin pins that will ever be exactly alike.
So
But
circle back around
to
for
round
me.
back to the question with the nibs,
Yeah,
you know, most nibs are going to start with a basic steel nib, and then you if someone's brand new, the suggestion would be start with either a medium or a fine nib. And a lot of pins, you can swap the nibs. It literally unscrews from the front of the pin. You can screw another size in, and then that will be a thicker line. And this is where every nib is different depending on if they're tuned, how they're tuned, who tuned them. So it's a general reference. A Japanese fine versus a German fine. Japanese nibs are going to be one size smaller than their, German counterparts. So
oh,
that's the other thing to keep in mind. So if I write with a Yovo or a Bach, those are the two big, well-known steel nib makers.
yeah.
I would have to use an extra fine because a medium is like a paintbrush with my small writing.
Ah,
Where, Beth just got at the pen show a double broad steel nib because she wanted it for like headers and things like that in her bullet journaling. So you can get nibs all the way from extra fine, even custom ground, down to what's known as a needle point, where that's going to be like your micron pin and your .003, from your
right,
art
right.
side, all the way up to, I think the largest nib I've ever seen, and it was a special thing Pelican did, was a oblique triple broad. So that would be like writing with a wide highlighter pen, and then the feed has to keep up with it. So there's a lot of stuff that plays in, but to boil it down to the simple terms, someone new, get a pen that you can change a nib on almost any pen.
Except mine.
So, well, and that's where if you wanted to expand your horizons, since you don't have Memphis doesn't really have a local pen shop, your options are online, drive out to Nashville, or drive to Little Rock, really.
Right. I'm in
But
the
there's
middle.
there's
Yeah.
stores like Vanessa is one of the few stores that, oh, this I like the look of this pen, and if within many options, they'll swap nibs. They order nibs separately, so you can say, oh, I really want this Esterbrook pin in this blue pattern, but I need a different nib size. Not everybody offers that service, so that's a unique thing that they do.
Oh, that's
Talking to them
cool.
at the store, because some pins like the Kaweco, if you've ever seen the little pocket pins, I don't have one handy. I didn't think we'd be talking about this, but they actually don't come with nibs in them. They ship
Oh,
the
wow.
bodies and the nibs separately. So as a
I mean, that
retailer,
makes sense
right?
for some
So
makers. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, but the Kaweco, so that way, you're selling the special edition green body, and then as a retailer, you could say, oh, well, here, what size nib do you need? And then you would screw it in at the time. Now, some retailers, that's obviously if you have a lot of people coming through and you have 5 pins, you might put one of each nib size so you can quickly go, oh, here's the fine one, you know, and send someone on their way. So it really kind of gets down into, but in a general sense, start with a medium or a fine, depending, if you tend to write bigger, normally you want to go with a little bit bigger nib. If you write smaller, you're going to want to go with a smaller. So that's where medium is the middle, kind of the scale of 1 through 5 for a satisfaction survey of
Yeah.
best or most. It's the dead middle where it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where you're going to be your starting point, and then as you use it, you can adapt from there. And either that being a second pen, or buying a separate nib, or if you have a higher end pen, getting it ground if you're have access to a nib grinder or something like that.
So I'm gonna ask you one more question, and you can wrap it up. So in that vein, same question. You said steel and gold. So what? I don't know if it's material, but educate me on like my biggest concern when I'm putting a fountain pen to paper to draw. Writing, I just put up with what kind of the pen gives me, but fountain pens are one of the tools like watercolor and everything where you've got a liquid that flows, unlike an ink pen is kind of controlled by your pressure and so forth. What on a fountain pen, is it the nib? Is it the ink? I'm sure you're going to say it's a combo, but what controls flow, and is there a way to like, does gold flow better, retain better, or are they both kind of equal? Like what really controls the flow of ink? Like I'm sure pressure and opening up the tine a little bit moves the ink down, but like what's the basics of that?
Okay, let me see if I can show this with this camera set up well enough. It's a combo. So
I just need to know. Okay.
And this, because of how this camera is, the feed is this plastic part on this nib. These are the same nibs. One just happens to be black. This feed is going to let ink out at a certain flow rate on this nib.
Okay.
This feed is made of ebonite. Ebonite is going to put more ink out in general than the plastic equivalent.
Okay.
This is an ebonite pen, ebonite feed. Ebonite has a higher cost, so you're going to get that on your higher end pens.
Mm-hmm.
But that contributes to flow rate. The nib size contributes. You also, on a fountain pen, when you have the tines, if you want your pen to write a little bit wetter, the closer the tines are,
mm-hmm.
the less ink comes out. The more the ink is spread. So if you think about your dip pen from art school.
Yep.
When you put on the paper and you push down hard and it spreads those tines out and you get that wider line like you'd see in calligraphy.
Yeah.
That's the same thing. Now, most fountain pen nibs really aren't. You don't use fountain pen nibs for calligraphy.
No.
In general.
That I know.
Because these nibs are not really designed. There are flex fountain pen nibs, and which used to be kind of a standard when everybody was writing cursive in the 40s and 50s. So that's why vintage pens have such a resurgence, is people want those old nibs that were designed to flex. That are still around. And, there's been a big resurgence at the Arkansas show. There were probably 5 or 6 vendors who had hundreds of vintage pens. They'll get them, they'll restore them, they'll put a new rubber sack inside because rubber will deteriorate over time, clean it up, and then people will go buy it because they want that gold nib, because it used to be nibs were almost always gold. Like my friend Chris, who also lives in Memphis, he got his high-end Pelican pen. He was working at a jewelry shop, and he got it for $100 because someone brought it in to sell for gold scrap. So he got what is a Grail red Pelican made in West German pen that he could probably turn around and sell for $700 or $800 for $100, because that was the price of the gold in the nib. And he's like, he just paid out of his pocket to the shop. He's like, nope, here's the equivalent. I'll take the pen.
Jeez.
So it kind of all factors in. It's like you said, it's a combo, but in general, that flex, or if you're sketching with it, you're not going to expect to get a lot of line variation. You could force it, and with a steel nib, cheaper steel nib, you might be able to get another one for $10 or $15. So It's not a disposable thing, but it could be if you have an accident.
See,
If you
I didn't
drop it
know
and
that
it
the
lands nib down on
yeah.
the your kitchen floor, sometimes they can be bent back into shape and retuned. Sometimes you need a new nib. It really just kind of depends.
Gotcha. I didn't realize that the little, I don't know what the proper name was, on the bottom of the nib
The
with
feed.
the feed. I didn't realize, well, there's the name, the feed had a lot to do with it. Okay. I thought it was just
Yeah,
all the
there's
nib because that comes from the thinking of dipping and the ink sitting on the tip, you know.
right,
There
and
you go.
that's where that's one of the big differences between your art dip pen and a fountain pen. Fountain pens have feeds
Yeah.
that are feeding from an inkwell of sorts, so you're not having to dip it in each time. So that feed helps regulate and dry. That's why it's got the little fins in it. If you think of from heat dissipation or a radiator or something like that, those little fins. If you didn't have that and it was just a solid piece, then it would probably let ink out too much. So it kind of like has to go through each step to deliver it.
So do you think you'd be
But
giving an educational class today?
hey, you never know. This is trying this for the first time, see how it went, and you start with basic questions, but that's a good part of this is you can learn and answer questions that someone else is going to have. So, it's great because it's things I know enough about to give an answer, and I also know enough that if I don't know the answer to say I don't know, but let me point you to some resources who can better explain it.
Yeah, yeah. I
But
mean, you
luckily, your
educated me quite a
questions did
bit.
not. Your questions I knew enough to answer. I feel pretty confidently.
Yeah, you gave me
So
some great answers, so I appreciate it.
yeah. So just kind of wrap up. You mentioned you're a photographer, you're an artist. Where can people find you online to see, what you're up to or your film work or stuff like that? Where can people find you if they wanted to learn more about Chase and his art or film or photography exploits?
Everything I do is under the name Chasing Photography. So my Instagram is Chasing Photography and my website is chasingphotography.com. So I post, at least I try to post once a week on Instagram. Some of my portrait work and stuff is up on Chasing Photography and Chasing Photo for YouTube that has some older stuff. But yeah, that's where you can find me. And you can always contact
Oh,
me through Instagram.
okay. Well, once again, I want to say thanks to Chase for taking some time today. And also, don't forget if you're shopping at Vaness, looking for a new nib like we were talking about or some new inks, you can use the code DWRDNET or so, you can use the code DWRDNET to get 10% off your purchase. Some exclusions apply. So be sure and look at the item description to make sure you're not adding something in that's going to be excluded if you're looking to get that discount when you order. So, Chase, I appreciate it, and we'll see you on the
Thank you.
next episode.
Take
So thanks for sticking around to watch the first ever interview that I did for the DWRDNET YouTube channel. I hope to be adding in more guests to interview them and talk about their place in the fountain pen hobby and the stationery community as a whole. I'm trying to line up some of the pen makers, people who are well known in the community for ink swatching, or they are known for running a store or visiting pen shows. So stay tuned to be sure you're subscribed to the channel so you can see as these new interviews are released. So I hope you enjoyed it, and please come back and watch the next episode.